Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to have a little look at the exam question you can see on your screen, which focuses on discussing the possible consequences of changes. And in this case, these are changes that refer to a couple of population pyramids that you have been given. So let's have a little look at how we can approach this. Now, the population changes are presented to us through two graphs, and we can see Japan in 2019 and Japan in 2049. And the key change that you should realize in Japan's case, that is in the future, there is going to be an increasing number of people in the much older age groups. For example, 75 to 79 is running at almost 9 million people in Japan, compared to in 2019, when that age group only had roughly 8 million or so, or slightly less than 8 million. So that's more than 1 million people in that very old age group. In contrast, Japan, in the youngest age groups, as we can see, is going to have fewer. So it has about 5 million people approximately in 2019 in the 0 to 4 age group, but in contrast, it's got under 4 million by 2049. So the key to answering this question is to identify consequences and issues that relate to an expansion in the very old, less people in these middle age years, especially in the before 40-year-olds, and very few in the youngest age groups. Now, there is no need to actually explain the reasons for this change. You are just being asked to discuss possible consequences, and those consequences don't need to be necessarily negative, because the word consequences could also refer to positive, and I'll give you an idea about how a positive consequence could be used in the context of this answer. You don't need to have studied anything about Japan either, because you're only being asked to discuss possible. So what's the likely? Doesn't mean that they will be, but what's the likely consequences? So let's think about consequences of a very high aging population. The first issue is that high numbers of elderly are going to need to be provided with pensions because they are unable to work beyond a certain age. This is going to put increased stress on the government to raise money in order to find the money for the pensions of this largely expanded elderly population. Now, a consequence of that is going to be the need to potentially raise taxation in order to find the money to pay for those pensions. Another solution, but also a consequence, would be that Japan might choose to raise the age of the retirement to 70 or beyond. And that would mean that people couldn't get their government pension till this older age. Now, that's a consequence. Linked consequence to that is this might, however, be very unpopular with the voting population of Japan, especially the elderly, who might want and wish to be able to retire to a younger age and still receive their government pension. Now, we've dealt with pensions. Let's deal with another aspect of the elderly, which is that they are quite high consumers of healthcare. And a lot of the budget of healthcare in Japan will go towards primarily the elderly. So with more elderly, the healthcare system of Japan is going to feel more pressure. It's going to have to expand the number of hospitals it has that can deal with health issues that relate to their very elderly, which is going to have a cost. It's also going to have to train additional doctors in order to work in these new hospitals in order to provide that increased level of healthcare. That's going to put more pressure on the education system of Japan to ensure that more doctors and medical professionals are being trained, as well as the economy of Japan, which is going to have to finance this expanding healthcare sector. A third consequence for Japan is the care system. Elderly people don't just need pensions and healthcare, but they also need additional housing needs as well as care services. So Japan is going to have to consider increasing the amount of care facilities and specially adapted homes that it builds, which is going to put pressure both on the country but also on the building system of Japan in order to ensure that there is enough housing that's appropriate for this aging population. Likewise, care services that might involve providing mental health care services or support services or catering services to the very elderly, especially in the very old age groups, that's going to need financed, which is going to put pressure on government resources. Okay, we spent quite a bit of time thinking about the implications and the consequences of a very old population. What about the younger years, the fact that there are fewer in the 35 to 39, 30 to 34, 25 to 29? Well, these are the highly active year groups in an economy who work very long hours and generate high levels of work and wealth for the economy, as well as taxation for the government. Now, with fewer of these people, the first implication is less jobs are going to be getting done, which is going to reduce the amount of capital the government's taking from taxation. Second of all, with fewer skilled young adults, Japanese companies are going to start to look elsewhere in order to operate in other countries where there is a higher labor force. Consequence of the fact that there is a very reduced labor force is that wages are likely to be driven upwards, which will further pressure companies to either leave Japan or companies elsewhere may choose not to establish in Japan due to these high wages. An advantage, however, if you are in the younger age groups, is finding employment and having a higher wage is going to be more likely in Japan in the future because of the reduction in the workforce. If we look at the youngest age groups, the implication here is that education services are going to have to start to contract in Japan. There's going to be less demand for primary and secondary and further education, which is going to lead to rising unemployment in this particular sector. But also because there are fewer educated people coming through, that's going to put a pressure on the number of skilled people working in Japan. A lack of 20, 25, 30, 35-year-olds is also going to further contract birth rates in the future, because if these young adults aren't there in the population in large numbers, then there's not going to be many children being born. So the problem is only going to get worse in the future. If we consider an advantage, however, for Japan, a couple of advantages. First of all, elderly people don't just retire when they get to 65. They often choose to work for many years after that, and they're actually highly reliable, efficient members of the economy. And therefore, Japan might actually benefit from having a capable aging working population who can fill the jobs, especially as they are very reliable and skilled because they've been working for a long time. A second advantage is this elderly population is likely to be spending a lot of money in certain sectors of the economy. It's often referred to as the grey pound. It's the wealth spent by the aging population. So things like travel and tourism and the beauty industry, as well as certain areas of the sports industry, are going to benefit significantly from having large numbers of elderly who participate and spend a lot of their money that they've saved up during their working life in these particular energy areas. So there will be a boost in those sectors of the economy. Okay, I've covered a lot of grounds. It's worthwhile noting those points down and ensuring that you could have 9 points. You'll notice a number of my points developed from one point to another point because they are linked. So the key thing there is just to make it very clear that they are separate points. So when you're going to link points and develop them, say the first consequence is, and then explain the consequence, and then say linked to this is another consequence, which is, and then make your second point. And that's a nice, quick and clear way of establishing your 9 points to get your 9 marks.